I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Professor Duane Roller has taught the classics at various institutions, including 20 years at Ohio State University. He got his PhD in classical archaeology from Harvard. He's a real live Indiana Jones. He spent 34 years as a field archaeologist in Greece, Turkey, Israel, Jordan, Italy, and southern Mesopotamia, survey in the heel of Italy. He has received numerous national grants, including ones from the National Geographic Society and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He was a Fulbright scholar 4 times, with postings in India, Poland, Austria, and Malta. He's the author of 14 books and over 200 scholarly articles of field archaeology, ancient history and literature, and musicology as it relates to the ancient world. His book, Cleopatra, a biography, became a bestseller and has been translated into several languages. I'd like to welcome our speaker, Professor Duane Roller, to the Sunday Symposium.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you. Usually I don't get introduced twice. Once is usually enough for most people. But anyway, we'll plunge on here. And I think we can agree that Cleopatra is probably the most famous woman from classical antiquity, a woman who was exceedingly important in the political and cultural dynamics of our world, but a woman who has been greatly misunderstood, not so much from her reputation in her own era, but from later representations by people such as Shakespeare and George Bernard Shaw. So let's cast ourselves back, starting to the time of the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. Alexander died at Babylon, 323. He was only 33 years of age. It was totally unexpected. And he, of course, had made this epic journey all the way to India and back and brought those areas, at least theoretically, under Greek culture. But when he died, he left no provisions for what would happen after he died. And squabbling took place among his successors for the next 40 years. And what concerns us now is one of those successors, a man named Ptolemy, who established himself in the new city of Alexandria in Egypt and gained a certain amount of status because he absconded with Alexander's body and had it buried there. And so he established a kingdom in Egypt, effectively, which Alexander had conquered, and he and his successors ruled for 300 years. And so we have to go down through 12 successor Ptolemies all the way to 69 BC, when Cleopatra is born to the 12th Ptolemy. We don't know who her mother is, which has caused a great deal of speculation, some of it more serious than others. Cleopatra is the second of eventually 5 children of King Ptolemy. And Ptolemy was not in a good shape in terms of his political standing. He was a spendthrift. He ended up being heavily in debt to the Romans, and he finally was run out of Egypt, perhaps taking his daughter, his young daughter, Cleopatra, with him to Rome. And there were a number of political convulsions, which I need not go into, but eventually Ptolemy XII was restored to his kingdom, and one of the ironies is that one of the people who helped restore him was Mark Antony, who meets 14-year-old Cleopatra for the first time, and they both claim later they'd fallen in love at that moment, which is probably a bit of revisionist history. And Ptolemy XII died early in 51 BC, and his will named 2 of his children, Cleopatra and Ptolemy, his son Ptolemy XIII, as heirs, and they assumed power. And Ptolemy XII, rather naively, I think, suggested that the 2 siblings could get along with each other and rule the kingdom. But they immediately started fighting. And very quickly, Cleopatra gains the upper hand. And then Ptolemy the 13th gains the upper hand. And this goes on for several years until finally the Romans have had enough. And Julius Caesar comes to Alexandria to straighten things out. This is part of a complex series of events involving internal convulsions in Rome, civil war in Rome, and the fact that Ptolemy the 12th had said, if my children can't get along, will you Romans help straighten things out? So Julius Caesar in 49 BC comes to Rome. He first supports Ptolemy the 13th. Cleopatra flees to Syria. She goes up to Antioch, where she may have had relatives, probably looking for a husband, we don't really know. And eventually she comes back to Syria, from Syria, and she and Julius Caesar come to an arrangement that's both personal and political. Caesar forces a reconciliation between the two monarchs, and warfare breaks out between the two monarchs, but Caesar, with the help of 3 Roman legions, gradually gains the upper hand. And obviously at this time, the relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra becomes personal as well. But even though that's part of the romance of Cleopatra, it's the subject of Shaw's play, Caesar and Cleopatra, that's not what's really important. What's really important is, with the Roman help, Julius Caesar eliminates Cleopatra's rivals to the throne and puts Cleopatra on the throne in 47 BC without any competition. Caesar and Cleopatra take their famous Nile cruise all the way up to the First Cataract, and Cleopatra is firmly Queen of Egypt. And Caesar eventually returns to Rome and places a statue of Cleopatra in the Roman Forum. And this did not help his reputation. The other thing is that Cleopatra is now pregnant. And her son, Caesarion, whom we saw in the Egyptian relief, is born in June of 47 BC. Now, it's important to realize that monarchs are always worried about the stability of their kingdoms or queendoms, and they're always worried about heirs. It's much easier for a king to produce an heir than it is for a queen. I mean, think of the obvious biological ramifications. For a queen, it takes a certain length of time. And Cleopatra, now queen, now sole ruler of Egypt, had to worry about who would succeed her. And so her liaison with Caesar is not the hormonal response of someone who can't control herself, as the tradition has it. It's a very definite connection with the most powerful Roman of the era. And an heir produced by Caesar and Cleopatra would be a person of great status and power. That's the way Cleopatra is thinking. And so Cleopatra goes back, Caesar rather, goes back to Rome, puts a statue of Cleopatra in the Temple of the Divine Julius, which you can still see today. You can't see the statue, it's long gone, but you can see where it was. And of course, we all know what happened on the Ides of March in 44. Caesar is assassinated. The reasons for this are very complex, but certainly his treatment of Cleopatra didn't help him. His wife, Calpurnia, had produced no children. And so here's Caesar going off and making it with a barbarian queen, producing an heir. That didn't play well in Rome. Cleopatra made at least 2 visits to Rome, lived in one of Caesar's villas while she was there with her son. Many other reasons for why Caesar was assassinated, but this is certainly one of them. Upon the death of Caesar, 44 BC in the springtime, the surviving head of state is Mark Antony. The Roman system elected 2 consuls every year, and they were the senior magistrates of the Roman Republic. And so with Caesar gone, Antony's effectively in charge. And remember, Antony and Cleopatra had met a decade previously. So they were known to each other. And Antony certainly expected to be Caesar's legal heir. And in the Roman system, when you're the heir of someone important, this carries political connotations. You're inheriting that person's status, that person's power, not just his money. So Antony expected that he would move into a position of power, but it was not to be. Caesar appointed as his heir somebody almost no one had ever heard of, and that is a young man named Octavian, who was his grandnephew. Octavian at the time was in the Balkans, attending to some things there, and he was only 17 years of age. And as a spoiler alert, Octavian is going to become the Emperor Augustus. So civil war breaks out once again, and Octavian and Antony get together and divide the world between them. They divide the world ostensibly in order to deal with the residue of the assassination of Caesar. Shakespeare has only a dozen or so assassins, but there are really about 60. It was a very widespread conspiracy, and these assassins are spread all over the Roman world. So Caesar, Octavian, and Antony go out and try to stomp on this residue. Octavian takes the West and is not in our story for a few years. Antony, however, takes the East. And one thing that Antony does is to make his headquarters at Tarsus, the old Assyrian trading post right at the northeast corner of the Mediterranean. It's in modern Turkey. And after the 2 main assassins are eliminated, Brutus and Cassius, in 42, Antony sets himself up at Tarsus and summons all the important monarchs of the East to come to see him. And these include many people we know little about, but a couple of important people like Herod the Great of Judea, who is just acceding to the throne, the Herod of the Bible, and of course, Cleopatra. And here we have one of the great moments of Cleopatra's career, in which, as Shakespeare describes so wonderfully, taken almost literally from the ancient sources, she sailed up the Tarsus River in what Shakespeare calls her barge, her state ship, and with dancing girls and women singing in the lines and so forth, and all kinds of music and scents. Clearly, we have an eyewitness account. She comes, she meets Antony. Antony goes on the ship, and he's not seen again for a few days. Now, this is the point where it begins to get difficult to understand both Cleopatra and Antony, because we move into a world of romance here. Obviously, the relationship quickly became personal. 9 months later, Cleopatra gives birth to twins. But again, I must reemphasize that Cleopatra, who has one son who could drop dead any moment, is still thinking of heirs. Caesar is gone. Who's the most powerful Roman? Antony. So producing heirs through Antony is the wise thing to do. But as we know, the situation will eventually deteriorate. But that's one thing to remember about Cleopatra. I'm going to point out several markers here that go against the received tradition. She was not promiscuous. As far as we know, she had 2 relationships in 18 years. I don't think that's promiscuous by any standard. And the relationships were with the most powerful Romans of the era. They were politically necessary. So Antony, who is still in power, Octavian and Antony had established after Caesar's death a triumvirate with a third person we don't need to concern ourselves with, three of them in power to ostensibly settle the world after the death of Caesar. But it very quickly turns into a personal squabble between Octavian and Antony. And especially when Antony is found to have fathered children by Cleopatra, he's going to set off on a great expedition to the Parthians, who are the one power that could give Rome difficulty, essentially on the Iranian plateau. And the Romans are supporting this, but the Parthian expedition, we're now down to about 36, 35 or so, is a total disaster. He was misled by his local guides. He got caught in the winter snows in Armenia. And the sources tell us he lost 30,000 men, probably exaggerated. Such numbers always are. But still, it was a total disaster. Antony struggles back to the coast, feels like he can't go home again, and summons Cleopatra for aid, and eventually returns to Alexandria with her, never to go back to Rome again. Now, one little problem here is that under the conditions of the triumvirate after the death of Julius Caesar, actually in 40, Antony had married Octavian's sister, Octavia. And actually, they had had some children. So here is Antony kind of pushing the limits of even the free morality of the era. He's married to a distinguished Roman woman, and it happens to be the sister of one of the two most powerful men in Rome at the era. Yet he's spending a lot of time with this barbarian queen. And remember, the word barbarian doesn't imply that these are unwashed people who don't know how to dress themselves. It simply means they're not Roman. He's spending a lot of time with Cleopatra, having children with her, and there's soon going to be a third child. And after the Parthian expedition, he feels like he can't go back to Rome, even though Octavia offered to finance a new round against Parthia. He goes to Alexandria. He spends the rest of his life with Cleopatra in Alexandria, and as I said, has a third child. Antony's motivations during the last years of his life are very difficult to understand. And scholars have worked very hard to figure out, was the guy just bonkers? Was he simply in beyond his depth? There is some evidence of alcoholism. There is some evidence of being clinically depressed. But from this time on, Antony begins to act very strangely. Here he is, the most powerful person in Rome, and yet he's never going to return to Rome. Meanwhile, Cleopatra has worked very hard to make her kingdom stable. Her father had kind of left things in a mess when he died back in 59. He was heavily in debt to the Romans because of lavish living. There were pressures from all around. A new rival to the control of the East showed up in 40, Herod the Great, and Herod and Cleopatra would be at each other's throats as long as Cleopatra lived. And so what Cleopatra wants to do, and again, we fixate on her personal relationships, we don't realize she was a very skilled administrator and political leader. What she wants to do is restore the kingdom to the glories of the dynasty of 100 years previously. And that's when the kingdom begins to spread beyond Egypt, begins to spread across the North African coast, begins to spread up into the Levant and Asia Minor, places that historically had belonged to the dynasty, but had kind of been chopped off by Roman expansion in the last 100 years or so. And she's contending with Herod the Great constantly, who wants to make his own kingdom, extending from Syria to Egypt, but Cleopatra owns the coast. So the two of them are at each other's throats, and Cleopatra at one point tries to negate the issue by offering Herod the role of her military chief of staff, but Herod's smart enough to decline this. He knows to be subordinate to Cleopatra would only be trouble. And so the situation in the east between Herod and Cleopatra becomes difficult, but at the same time, Cleopatra stabilizes the kingdom. She returns its economy to stability, and she at the same time also becomes a published author. This is typical of royalty of this period. They were educated people. We don't know much in detail about Cleopatra's education, but we know that she lived in the town with the greatest library in the world, literally right next door to it. So surely she had access to the library at Alexandria, which had everything that had ever been written, not only in Greek, but in other languages as well. And one of the unusual things about Cleopatra, again, which does not show up in the Romantic tradition, is that she was a published medical author. She wrote several treatises on medical subjects, and she was a linguist. We know that she spoke 12 languages, and that she was famous for addressing envoys in their own language. We can't really come up with 12 that we're certain with, but certainly Greek and Latin, probably native languages of Egypt, Egyptian, things like that. Very likely Hebrew and Aramaic, we don't really know. But this was astounding. Nobody had ever done this before, with a couple of rare exceptions, that when an ambassador came to Cleopatra's court, Cleopatra could talk to that person in his own language. But anyway, the political situation coming down into the 30s BC continues to deteriorate. And mostly it's Antony who's the problem here. And as I said, we don't really know why. But Antony and Cleopatra set themselves up in Egypt, and Antony starts giving Cleopatra new territory. Now, this is legal under his role as a standing Roman magistrate. Remember, his commission is to settle affairs of the East after the death of Caesar. And we're only about 10 years after the death of Caesar here, and things are still unstable. But the Romans begin to draw the line when Antony starts giving parts of Roman territory to Cleopatra. That's of dubious legality. Most specifically, parts of Crete and parts of North Africa west of Egypt, what's modern Libya. And also the contentiousness between Cleopatra and Herod becomes a problem, and Antony sometimes doesn't know which way to jump on this one. As I said, Cleopatra owns the coast, Antony owns the interior. And this means that Antony's reputation in Rome begins to sink. Remember also that he's married to Octavian's sister. Yet he's never come back home. He's fathered children with Cleopatra, and Octavia endures it for as long as she can, but eventually divorces Antony in her last years. And so an intense propaganda war develops between Antony and Octavian, which really has the subtext of a family squabble. Look what you're doing to my sister. You're out here with this queen. She's at home in Rome. We know exactly where she lived. You can go in the Palatine in Rome today and visit her home. She's raising your children, but you're never coming home. And so the situation deteriorates, and the way to emphasize the situation is to blame Cleopatra for everything. Cleopatra seduced Antony, both literally and figuratively. Cleopatra drove Antony out of his mind, which doesn't say much for Antony, but at the same time, as I said, there's evidence that Antony wasn't totally stable in his last years. And so the Roman world begins to bifurcate between supporters of Antony and supporters of Octavian. And the reputation of Cleopatra is tangled up within this. But again, if you step outside of the romantic tradition, you get a totally different view of Cleopatra. This was the era of messianic talk in the Eastern Mediterranean. The kind of environment that, of course, would culminate a couple of generations later with Jesus of Nazareth. But Jesus, of course, was one of many people who are seen to be the Messiah, which can be interpreted any way you want it to. But we have a number of pieces of literature, prophecies. There's a body of prophecies existing from the era of Cleopatra. And it basically says somebody will come and liberate the people and restore a prosperous, normal world. And of course, we know what direction this went in Christian thought, but it was suggested that liberating the world refers to getting the Romans out of town, and the person who would do this would be Cleopatra. So Cleopatra in the tradition is seen as a potential Messiah. You know, this is hardly the promiscuous bimbo of tradition. So that's another point worth knowing about Cleopatra. She was so powerful and so well respected in the Eastern Mediterranean that she could be the one who would liberate the world from ever expanding Roman control. The Romans had been on a roll really ever since the defeat of Hannibal at the end of the 3rd century. And they had spread into Asia Minor, they had spread into North Africa, kind of like two jaws pointing toward Egypt and Herod's kingdom, which was the only area, say, from Syria to the frontier, western frontier of Egypt, was practically the only area in the Mediterranean that the Romans did not control. When was this Roman expansionism was going to stop? And who was going to stop it? Cleopatra was certainly a likely candidate. So by the end of the 30s BC, the political situation has gotten totally out of control. And Cleopatra realizes that her kingdom is badly threatened. And it's threatened in large part because of the erratic things that Antony is doing and this inexorable Roman expansion. Egypt produced a significant amount of the grain of the ancient world. So Egypt was economically important to the Romans. And the Romans had been buying Egyptian grain for many generations. And an unstable Egypt, or worse, an Egypt under the control of people hostile to Rome, was a serious economic detriment to the Roman economy. So Octavian decides that he has to move against Antony and Cleopatra for economic reasons and for the personal reasons of the way Antony has been treating his sister, even though they're finally divorced. And so, as I said, the Roman world begins to split. Antony has a lot of support in Rome. He comes from a very distinguished family. He had two brothers who were important people of the era. If Antony had never become embroiled with Cleopatra, we'd still know about him as an important personality of the era. So Antony has a lot of support. Octavian is still the young kid on the block, but nevertheless, the situation is deteriorating rapidly. And Cleopatra and Antony decides they have to be proactive on this one. And so they take their forces and move east up the Mediterranean, first establishing headquarters in Ephesus, and then moving on to Athens. And Cleopatra is commanding the naval forces. So that's another thing, our promiscuous bimbo, that we forget about. She actually commands fleets in battle. And she'd done this once before after the death of Caesar in 44. She offered her forces and moved toward Italy, but was told basically her services were not needed at that time. Octavian seizes Antony's will and makes a selective reading of it. And this is one of the great enigmas of the era, because what Octavian reads is almost too good to be true, that he was going to give everything to Cleopatra, that he was thinking about setting himself up as king of the East and so forth and so on, and that Cleopatra's children would rule the Eastern Mediterranean, including Roman territory after him. As I said, it's an enigma. Because it's hard to imagine that Octavian would make it up because anyone else could read the rill. But it's hard to imagine that Antony would be so stupid to say the things that he was quoted as saying. But we just don't know. But nevertheless, it gives Antony a political edge on this. And so Cleopatra and Antony move up the Mediterranean. And you remember that place called Actium on the west coast of Greece. It's a place of no importance whatsoever. There was an ancient temple of Apollo there going back to early Greek times. And that was it. But Antony and Cleopatra positioned themselves there to block any movement from Italy to Egypt. It just happens to be a strategic point. But again, in the later tradition, it becomes very famous as the great battle that saved the Roman Republic from barbarism. Because on the 2nd of September, 31 BC, the forces engage. Octavian's coming down from Italy, from Brundisium, modern Brindisi. Antony and Cleopatra are coming up from Egypt. And in the midst of the battle, Cleopatra disengages her forces and returns to Egypt. And again, the tradition says she was a coward. She turned and ran. No, she knew that if the Roman forces turned to their position, Egypt would be exposed. So she returns to Egypt. Antony abandons his own forces and goes back with her, knowing that the battle is lost and he's had it if he's taken by the Romans. And so they return to Egypt. And the situation has pretty much reached the end now. We're in the autumn of 31 BC. And over the next autumn and winter and into the summer of 30, Octavian makes a triumphal journey around the Eastern and the Mediterranean. Everybody supports him. They know the handwriting on the wall on this one. All the local kings and dynasts, including Herod the Great, welcome him, supply him. And Antony eventually, by the late autumn of 31, parks on the east side of Alexandria with the Roman army. Now, just to digress for just a minute, I've told you 4 things that are outside the tradition of Cleopatra and show what a person of great skill and ability she was. And let me remind you, a linguist, a published medical author, not promiscuous, commanded her own fleet in battle twice, and so respected, she was seen by some as the Messiah, if you interpret the Messiah in a political, not a religious way. For nearly a year, Antony and Cleopatra and Octavian are at a stalemate. Octavian is parked outside of Alexandria. Cleopatra and Antony are essentially besieged within the city. And there's some engagements which don't go well for Cleopatra and Antony. Cleopatra starts talking about fleeing Egypt and going to India, which was well known as a major trade partner of the Romans by this time. She pulls her ships across the isthmus into the Red Sea, but the locals burn them. Again, they know who's going to win all of this. And eventually, at the beginning of August in 30 BC, Cleopatra tricks Antony into killing himself. Obviously, she knows he's a liability now. She knows he's the problem. And she has the feeling if she could just get Antony out of the way, maybe there would be some hope for her. And remember, she has 4 children. And so she's probably thinking ahead. And she takes her oldest child, Caesarion, the one allegedly with Julius Caesar, who is about 16 or 17 now, loads him up with gifts and presents and sends him on the way to India to hope to survive. But Octavian's agents catch him and kill him. So all is gone. Her younger children are too young. They're less than 10. And so Antony is tricked into suicide. We saw the painting of his dying Antony being hoisted into Cleopatra's tomb. The fact of getting rid of him doesn't work. Octavian wants to take her back to Rome and exhibit her. She's not going to have any of that. And 10 days later, the 10th of August, 30 BC, she kills herself. Now, again, the received wisdom is she killed herself with the bite of an asp. This is probably not true. It was probably poison. Killing yourself with an asp is logistically very difficult. Herpetologists have looked into this. It doesn't work very well. And even within a year or two of her death, people were questioning the asp story, but it's a much more interesting tale than poison. And within 2 or 3 years, Roman poets were writing about Cleopatra and the asp. But that's probably the 5th of the unusual things about Cleopatra, that she probably went the conventional way with poison, which is the easiest way to do yourself in antiquity. Any physical way is difficult. Antony tried to kill himself with a sword and bungled it so totally he had to get one of his servants to do it. So the asp story, which I said is documented within 2 or 3 years, is probably a fiction. We actually know that her physician, a man named Olympus, wrote a treatise titled The Death of Cleopatra. We have no quotation, we have some quotations from it, and there's no mention of an asp. Poison. So what happens now? 10th of August, 30 BC. Octavian takes charge of Egypt by right of conquest. The Ptolemaic kingdom, which goes all the way back to the first Ptolemy, back in the 330s, has come to an end. And Egypt is incorporated into the Roman system. But as the Roman system evolves and Octavian becomes the Emperor Augustus, he forbids anybody to go to Egypt without his personal position. He doesn't want another Antony setting himself up there. Egypt becomes a Roman province on the 29th of August. The 3 surviving children of Cleopatra are all that remains of the great Ptolemaic kingdom. 2 of them die rather quickly. They're all exported to Rome, all transported to Rome. 2 of them simply drop from the record very quickly and probably died. They're 6, 7, 8 years old. They've seen the death of both of their parents. They're removed from mild Egypt to not so mild Rome. And they probably just died. Child mortality was very high and their lives are totally disrupted. The one interesting one is the only daughter, the oldest surviving one. And she comes to Rome. Ironically, she's raised by Octavia, Antony's late wife, who raises all the surviving children of Antony. Antony's the one who's promiscuous. He had children scattered all over the Eastern Mediterranean. And many of them are brought back to Rome and raised by Octavia. And when the Romans decide to organize Northwest Africa, that's essentially modern Morocco and Algeria, they have a dispossessed king of that region, a man named Juba, and they marry him to the daughter, Cleopatra Selene was her name, Cleopatra the Moon. And they're set up as king and queen of a new kingdom of Mauritania. And Cleopatra Selene makes every effort to reconstitute her mother's kingdom. She imports Egyptian art. You go to the museum in modern Churchill, 1,000 miles from Egypt, and you see sculptures of the pharaohs, inscriptions and hieroglyphics, trying to reconstitute things. Of course, she didn't know how things would play out. She didn't know whether Octavian would survive. He lived until he was 76 years of age. And that, of course, transformed the Roman Empire. But in the 20s BC, nobody knew that was going to happen. So there was a real possibility a new Ptolemaic kingdom might come into being in Northwest Africa. And she imported scholars from Alexandria. Her husband, Juba, was a major scholar of the era, sent out explorers, did 2 things that are with us today. One is he discovered and named the Canary Islands. And the other is he did botanical research under the supervision of his physician and botanist Euphorbus. And if you've got any euphorbia or anything from the genus Euphorba in your yards, that goes back to the daughter of Cleopatra. So the world came to an end for the Ptolemies in the summer and autumn of 30 BC. But what I want to leave you with is that the Cleopatra of history is not the Cleopatra of tradition. She was a skilled and capable administrator who fought very hard to save a dying kingdom. A well-educated woman, a person so respected that she was seen as the Messiah. And we have evidence of a local cult of Cleopatra surviving in Egypt into the 4th century AD. That's well after the advent of Christianity in that region, and people are still worshiping Cleopatra. So she stands with us as the most famous woman of antiquity who did not die from the bite of an asp. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rollins. We're going to go into question and answer period. And for questions here at the Burger, if you will hold the mic close to your mouth since you're going to be masked so we can hear your question. And George, you have something out in there. We're going to start with a question in here, and then we're going to go over to you for Zoom, if that sounds good.
Let me just say that those on Zoom, if you would either put a comment in the chat, or if you know how to, raise your hand. We'll call on you next.
Great. Do we have any questions? Yep, hold on here.
That was a great talk. I really learned a lot and clarified a lot of my thinking. Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit about Octavian's military background, or how he was quite skilled at military affairs and strategies?
Well, the question is about Octavian's background militarily. Obviously, he showed promise at an early age because Caesar would not have chosen him as his successor. We know relatively little, and what we do think we know has been corrupted by the later tradition of the wonders of the Emperor Augustus, obviously. But he was in the Balkans, in what's now Dalmatia, or whatever country that is now, getting ready for Caesar's own expedition against the Parthians, which, when Caesar was killed, Antony took over. And so he certainly had military training. He'd been with Caesar earlier, and he's one of those people who comes from nowhere and shows unexpected great skill. And it's a little hard to understand. When Octavian came to Rome in the summer of 44, Cicero says, "We'll humor the kid for a bit and get rid of him." And that was one of the big mistakes of the era. But it's just hard to say, why should somebody with relatively little training and knowledge at the age of 17 become eventually the ruler of the whole world? But that's what happened.
George?
Question from the Zoom. Would you say that Cleopatra could have been a better military leader than Antony?
Well, both. Well, yeah, could Cleopatra have been a better military leader than Antony? The problem here is the deterioration of Antony's character. He was older than Cleopatra, and he'd been around for quite a while, and had been essentially Caesar's aide, first lieutenant, whatever you want to call him, for a number of years. And so he was a very skilled military leader. But especially beginning with the Parthian expedition, things went badly wrong for him. This, of course, is traditionally because he was besotted with Cleopatra, but that's not the case. Obviously, he began to misjudge things. Now, if he'd not been involved with Cleopatra, would his career have gone on in a better direction? He was only in his 50s when he killed himself, quite possibly. But he certainly was one of the great military leaders of the era, but somehow it all evaporated. Cleopatra, on the other hand, what little we know about her military skills seemed to indicate that she was a first-rate naval commander, at least. There's no evidence that she ever commanded land forces.
Yes, thank you for a great presentation. I do have a question.
Yeah.
What was
I'm not getting the microphone.
What was Cleopatra's race?
Well, that's a naughty question, Cleopatra's race, and it's taken up a lot of verbiage recently. On her father's side, she, of course, was Macedonian, and this goes all the way back, and probably some Persian mixed in, because Macedonian royalty had mixed in with the Persian royalty. It's the mother that's the problem. And we simply do not know who her mother was. We can speculate that her mother was a woman of importance, because Cleopatra would not have been pushed forward if she'd just been kind of a quickie liaison with her father. There must have been a connection with a person of importance. And the best evidence is that she might have been a member of the Egyptian aristocracy. We can support this by the fact that she was the first of all of her dynasty to learn Egyptian, and this is a point emphasized by the ancient authors. So Macedonian, Greek, Persian, probably Egyptian, but that's as far as we can take it.
Sure, over here, please.
If there ever,
Microphone.
I was wondering if they ever found burial ground of Cleopatra, her tomb.
I didn't,
There was a lot of research done archaeological to find the burial ground of Cleopatra.
well,
her
she would have
tomb.
been buried in the royal tombs of the Ptolemies, which are in Alexandria. We know where they were. We don't have them. Royal tombs are susceptible to destruction, of course, but
Yeah.
within the compound of the royal precinct of Alexandria, there was the palace, there was the library, there was the tomb of Alexander the Great, which still existed because Octavian went and saw it. And there would be the tomb of all the Ptolemies, and that presumably is where she is buried.
So, but it has never been found really. They
No,
could not-
no, no,
Okay,
no.
Thank you.
No physical remains or tombstones or anything of the Ptolemaic dynasty has ever been found, and Alexander's tomb has never been found, but we know where they were.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, Judy?
Okay, so we're having a lot of political issues in our country right now. Has this ever happened before?
Well, the world has been in a state of chaos since the beginning, of course, and I think political issues are always there. We think of the death of the assassination of Caesar and what happened to Antony and Cleopatra as little points, but the Romans have been having civil war for nearly a century. The seeds that culminated in the squabble between Cleopatra, Antony, and Octavian were planted back in the 2nd century BC, mostly connected with Roman expansionisms and the inability of the Roman system to adjust to this. So I would say we can go all the way back as far as we have records and find this kind of problem existing, find polarization, find people who advance their own interests to the detriment of the greater good. There's nothing new or old really of any of this. It just goes round and round, and we may be coming to the end of human civilization, as many science fiction writers are now suggesting. We just don't know, but it goes on and never stops.
Do we have any other questions? Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful, wonderful talk. We hope you all have a wonderful Easter, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. We'll be discussing groundwater. Thank you so much.